policy development and implementation. She is a fellow of the prestigious National Academy of Public Administration and past president of the American Society for Public Administration and past editor-in-chief of the Review of Public Personnel Administration. She's received numerous awards for her research in leadership and mentoring, including, didn't you just win the Dwight Waldo Award? Ah, wonderful. Yeah. Dr. Guy is currently at the University of Colorado, Denver in a School of Public Affairs. Prior to that, she held the Jerry Collins Eminent Scholar Chair at the Askew School of Public Administration and Policy at Florida State University. And before that, she served as the department head at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. She holds a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling from the University of Florida, a master's degree in psychology from the University of South Carolina, and a PhD in political science from the University of South Carolina. We are so lucky to have someone of this level of accomplishment join us, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Mary Guy.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come. I have really loved my time, and I've loved the conversations that I've been able to have with you all. And what I want to do this evening is have another conversation with you, but first I'm going to talk at you. And then I want you to store up questions that you have, or challenges that you have, or thoughts that you have, and let's have a vibrant question and answer when I get that done. I want to talk to you about emotional labor and the evolving public service, because public service is evolving. And I'm hoping that we're getting to a point where we can have a more realistic canon that really describes more fully what public administration is all about. When we think about work, you know, it's work, work, work. We really pay most of our attention to the cognitive. That's what you are studying, that is what is in your textbooks, that's what you're tested on, that's what the job descriptions focus on. Most work in public service is knowledge work. So there is some manual labor, but there's not much. So it really is cognitive, but it's also emotional. And that's the piece that is not in your textbook, it's not in our theories, but in fact, that's the piece that causes people to feel like they're making a difference in people's lives. That's the piece that causes them to feel good about what they're doing and to come back tomorrow and do it again. So my argument is, let's be more realistic about public service work, and let's talk about all of it, not just the cognitive aspect of it. So I'm arguing for a paradigm shift, such that as important as data dashboards are, as important as benchmarks and outcome measures are, in fact, we must not lose sight of human heart. We must not lose sight of relationship. We must not lose sight of the importance of process and engaging one another. If governing is going to work, and we're concerned in these days about whether governing is working, citizens have to feel good about government and the people who deliver public services. And listen to our language. We will use emotive verbs, but then we turn around and we teach cognitive nouns. So my argument is that the affective component is something that we really, and I am in all my writing, I'm trying to insert that into the canon to make it okay to talk about emotion, to understand how holistic we must be if we really are going to capture the whole essence of what public service is about. So I'm arguing to focus more on relationship and less on numbers. Numbers are fine, but that's not the whole story. Our language has beaten us to the punch. Our language is already there. When we talk about governance instead of government, and when we say government, we think about the formal institutions, constructed, through constitutions and charters and so forth. When we think of governance, we think of all of the entities who care about life and community and well-being, and we put them all together in a basket and say, all together now, we can govern ourselves. When we think about collaboration, that's co-labor, that's working with one another. When we talk about co-production, that is working with one another. When we talk about citizen engagement, that means citizens who care about the greater community and are engaged with their neighbors as well as with the governing structures. We talk about trust a lot. You'll find many more articles that have trust just as a key word now than you would have just half a dozen years ago. If you talk about contracting or principal agent theory, that's sort of back in the shadows because it's too incomplete. It doesn't really capture the true dynamics involved in the contracting process. In fact, there's a whole literature on relational contracting, which is really based on trust. Son of a gun, people have discovered that if there is trust between a vendor and a contractor, that contract seems to work better. So, my argument is that we really need to enhance the relationship between citizens, between citizen and state, and those of us in public service are really well positioned to be catalysts for this. But first, we must be self-aware of this role. So, what does someone want when they come for public services? If you call 911, what do you want? You want a cool head and a warm heart. People come to government for services typically on the worst hour of the worst day of the worst week of their lives. They come to government when they can't get what they need from family or neighbors or community. And we need to be ready for that. So there's more to public service than meets the eye. There's certainly more than simply the cognitive aspects to that work. We also know, I know from my research, that emotional labor, those who are better at performing it, produce better outcomes in terms of service. I know this because a colleague and I, Chiwe Shea, and I did a study in Florida in which for juveniles who run into trouble with the law and so forth, they have to go through a treatment process where they are assigned a counselor and are counseled and so forth. And at the end of this treatment process, they then are asked to complete a satisfaction survey. And in that satisfaction survey, they answer questions like, do you feel like better squared away now than when you started? Was your counselor, effective for you? Would you if you had a friend in the same situation you were in, would you advise them to see the same counselor? And then, so we had that data, and then we surveyed the counselors, the workers, and we simply asked them questions about their capacity and their interest in performing emotional labor and being able to manage their own emotions, being able to manage the emotions of the clients and so forth. Those who scored, and then we just simply compared their surveys, we could match them with the clients that they had, and we found a positive, statistically significant positive relationship between the satisfaction scores on the clients and the workers who were better at performing emotional labor. We were, I was actually kind of surprised. I didn't think it would be that direct of a relationship, and there it was, just shining at us. Like, okay, take a clue from this, that's how I thought. So, we have words or terms for emotional labor. In law enforcement, verbal judo has been a popular term, which really gets at the management of the offender's emotion by sensing how that other person is feeling and then either upping the ante verbally or to bring them down, calm them down, verbal judo. Caring is obviously an obvious term. Game face, that expression is like, okay, put your game face on, here comes the president, in other words, put on your mask, put on your affective mask and display a particular feeling that you may not feel necessarily, but you put it on and you pretend. Showtime, okay gang, it's showtime, which means, again, You play a role, you put on a role, you put on the mask, you put on your costume. Emotional chameleon. I was interviewing an investigator with the Office of Public Guardian in Chicago. And this is an investigator has to go into homes and ask questions to determine if abuse is going on and so forth. And he says, the way I get the information I need is I'm an emotional chameleon. I may go in and immediately I'll sense whether I need to be really, really strong or whether I need to be really just a real softie. He said, I make that decision. It's instantaneous, but I know how to do it. I'm good at it, and I get a lot of information this way. The good cop, bad cop is self-evident. Spider sense was a term. I was interviewing a 911 call taker, and I said, how do you do your work? And she said, well, you listen to the call, and you have to find out what the problem is, make a determination in terms of what service is needed, and understand what the environment is like that I'm going to dispatch a provider to. So I need to know if I'm sending an officer into a house where there's going to be a gun. I need to know all these things. So she says, I listen very intently to the caller. I listen to the tone of voice, I listen to what they say, and I listen for background sound. She says, I listen to all of this, and she says, then I use my spider sense. And she says that spider sense is that creepy feeling I get when I know that I'm not getting all the information I need. And she says that in and of itself is information. And I use that when I'm to inform whoever I dispatch for services. It's an interesting sense. Rapport, it's a term with emotional armor is that sense of putting on your armor so that you don't get hurt, so that you can remove your heart a little bit from whatever you have to do, whether it's remove a child from a home. Emotional Teflon is a similar term, or just wearing a mask. These are all terms, different ways that we have of thinking about how we do this work. But it all gets to engagement. How do we engage the other? How does the other engage us? What is the feeling going to be at the end of the engagement? Is it a positive interaction? Is it a distant interaction? All of these are considerations. So whether you're a dispatcher, ostensibly just learning how to work all of this information, but in fact she never knows when she pushes the button on the next call whether it's going to be a child shrieking and guns going off, or whether it's going to be a crank call, or whether it's going to be a cat in the tree. She has no idea. Imagine. Wow. Your public information officer, this is a role that we take for granted, but listen, what do you expect from the public information officer? This is someone who is, called out in front of the television cameras, usually after an emergency where all information is not yet known. But this person is supposed to communicate in understandable language what has happened, is supposed to exude a sense of confidence and compassion because those are the desired mask the public information officer has to wear in order to elicit the kind of feeling from the listeners, either to calm down the public and say, it's going to be okay, it's just we need to evacuate our homes because there's a wildfire coming. But think about it in terms of what seems to be just transmitting information, but in fact, it's also transmitting a sense, a feeling about what's happening. And whether it's a feeling that should be one of urgency or whether it's one that says everything's basically okay. Whether it's a lights and sirens case or whether it seems to be something as calm as just an office environment. In many jobs, emotional labor is a very important aspect of it. Whether you are working with the true miseries of life, with problems of homelessness, or problems of terrible child abuse, public service jobs are emotionally intense. Not all the time, but often. It's a comes with. So what does it take? Well, it takes these four things, and humans are so good at the emotive component that in fact we do this without even thinking about it. You sense the emotive state of the other. Is that person excited? Is that person hysterical? Is that person calm? Is that person angry? And then you analyze your own state. How am I feeling regarding this? Am I frightened? Am I confident? Judge the best course of action and then behave accordingly. In other words, put on a mask, lower your voice, raise your voice, hug the person, move away from the person. All of these, we just do it. But that's all part of the emotional labor process. When the term emotional labor was coined by a sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, who in 1983 wrote a great book called A Managed Heart. And this was back in the days when airline attendants were really very pleasant. She wanted to know, what does it take, for the airline attendants to do their job? When it's very clear that, a lot of passengers, aren't, that they're surly or they're uncomfortable or they're scared or what have you. So she observed airline attendants doing their work, and then she interviewed them. And she says, what does it take to do this work? And as she came to realize that they must don a mask and they must act. And then the more we think about this in terms of retail sales and so forth, which is really where the term emotional labor got used the most. In other words, how to teach salespeople how to pitch the sale, how to sell the car. Well, public service is much more intense. You're not going to see the battered infant. You're not going to have the lights and sirens, in retail sales. But anyway, so the sociologists use two terms. They talk about, they assume that any employee simply acts and emotionally acts. So they call it surface acting and deep acting. And if you're reading Grandy's work or Wharton's work or Hochschild's work, it's all about surface acting and deep acting. So when I started doing this research, I was interviewing public servants, and one of them stopped me and they said, look, I'm not acting. And that's an insult to me, to call this acting. They say, I may pretend, I may have to wear a mask, I may have to pretend. Other than that, I'm authentic. And as I started interviewing more people and using the terms authenticity, it worked much better. And it's one more difference between public service and business service. So it's not so much Hollywood when it comes to public servants, not as much as in retail sales. The facts about emotional labor, it plays a role in about 75% of public service jobs. If you're a mail sorter for the Postal Service, you're really not very affected by it. If you're an accountant, you're probably not very affected by it. But in a lot of the work, you are affected by it. We know that it is both energizing and exhausting. We also know that it's part of an occupation, that some occupations require much more emotional labor than others do. So it's not simply that some people come into the job and they're just better at it, and that's the way it is. And it's not the kind of work that you do on Saturdays and Sundays. You don't do it on your day off. You do it in order to get the job done. In other words, it is attached to the job. We also know that to some degree, emotive skills can be developed and can be evaluated. Our literature isn't there yet. I've spoken to a number of HR trainers about it, and most are getting it. The question is how to insert it into the canon. Think a minute about display rules. Every profession sort of has its own rules. They're usually not written, they are unwritten, but it's a sense of how you are to comport, how you are to come across. If you're a law enforcement officer, you're to be confident, and you're to seem authoritative. If you are in a subordinate position, then you are expected to be conciliatory and compliant. If you are the receptionist at the front desk, everybody expects you to be warm and helpful and friendly, whether you feel warm and helpful and friendly. But that's a display rule of your job. If you may be in a job where it's perfectly appropriate to be stern and brisk and efficient. But as faculty, if we come across as stern and brisk and efficient, our course evaluation scores are going to be lower than if we come across as compassionate and caring and so forth. There are rules, unwritten rules, for how we are to behave. So I want you just to think about this. Every office has its own emotion culture. Think about an academic environment. You walk into an academic office or down a hall and it's very quiet. And if there's much noise, loud talking, it's like, that's unusual. There are other offices you can go into, and there's just a lot of commotion, and that's very normal. Each office has its own sense of what's appropriate behavior. So just think about it, and you'll get a sense, because you fit into it. Humans are so good at understanding the emotive piece in a way that we don't even use words for, but you will accommodate very quickly to the culture that you are in. Or if you don't, you become the outlier. You're the third standard deviation. So let's talk about hiring. We're always looking for good workers. But what do we find in job descriptions? Since the Pendleton Act was passed in 1883, we've been writing job descriptions that very clearly specify knowledge, skills, and abilities of the job. So here's just an example of a Child Protective Service caseworker. And this is just a classic job description. It talks about reports, talks about conducting assessments of alleged maltreatment, talks about providing social services to families in which abuse has been reported, and so forth. In other words, but it sounds kind of sterile. You know, it's like, okay, I know how to do this, I know how to write reports, I know how to gather evidence, and so forth. So that's what it sounds like the job is. But imagine if the job description were inclusive. Imagine if the job description actually also talked not about the cognitive requirements of the job, but the emotive requirements of the job. So here we see, the job description would say something like ability to keep calm under any circumstance, have a record of maintaining a hopeful yet realistic attitude, be able to de-escalate angry people, get along with coworkers, use improvisational responses, in other words, the emotional chameleon skills, to unanticipated circumstances. People leave, and Child Protective Services, for sure, they leave jobs because it is the emotional intensity of the job, and they were not prepared for it, they were not trained for it, they don't know how to manage it, and it becomes overwhelming. But there are many, many jobs that have significant emotionally intense aspects to it. And when we fail to say up front, this is part of the job, in fact, the person gets blindsided. And then they think, oh my God, it's just me. I'm the one who can't handle this. It's not fair. It's silly. We've tried to fit a round peg into a square hole when we fail to appreciate the wholeness of what public service jobs are like and what it feels like to do the work. So I want you to think about the emotive components in your job. What you have now, what you've had in the past. And when you start parsing it, it's pretty interesting to see that which is a normal part of the job and how that affects you. So what we want, of course, in all of our jobs is we want to just feel like it's just wonderful, that causes you to feel whole and satisfied and fulfilled, causes you to feel that you're doing meaningful work. But we know that emotional labor contributes to this sense. But what we talk about the most is burnout. And what we're afraid of is turning crispy. So how do we deal with this? Well, different professions have different words for it. Many professions, especially social services, have been far more focused on the negative part of emotional labor than on the positive. So if you're talking to a social worker and you say, gee, I just feel like I'm really suffering from vicarious trauma, they'll know exactly what you mean. You've heard just one story too many, and you can't get it out of your ears, can't get out of your head. Secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, emotional exhaustion. These are all terms that kind of get at the burnout or the threat of burnout. But burnout is not inevitable. With emotional labor, you have job satisfaction and you have burnout, and they're sort of different sides of the same coin, but they don't necessarily shine in the same intensity. And my hope in my work is to be able to convince people to pay attention to all of the good that emotional labor brings in terms of job satisfaction and fulfillment, and learn how to compensate and deal proactively to minimize the risk of burnout. So this is what in all of the work I've done in the statistical analyses, I was curious about emotional intelligence, because that was a construct that was developed certainly by Goldman and applied to the education industry, where emotional intelligence was treated as a trait, just like cognitive intelligence is treated as a trait. Well, among those who study emotional intelligence, these are the purple ellipses here. But normally, most theorists will divide emotional intelligence into three aspects: other awareness, self-awareness, and regulation of emotion. Other awareness meaning being aware of the other person's emotive state, self-awareness meaning being aware of one's own state, and regulation of emotion meaning the capacity to regulate one's own emotional state. In other words, to calm yourself down or to psych yourself up. So I wanted to know if emotional intelligence was just the absolute mediator in terms of the performance of emotional labor. And it's actually not that direct. We know that just performing emotional labor, regardless of how anyone scores on emotional intelligence, has a positive relationship with job satisfaction. We also know that the performance of emotional labor has a positive relationship to burnout. But here's the interesting piece, and this is what I tell trainers. This is where HR can really make a difference. The better someone is at regulating their own emotional state, the less likely they are to suffer burnout. So helping employees develop their own sensitivity to their emotional state, and then learning to regulate it, to learn how to put really terrible visions and smells and senses in a cabinet in the mind and close that door, is important, and it really makes a difference. So this triangle is really very useful to understand. And that's true in data I've collected in the US, and data I've collected in Korea, and data I've collected in China, and data I've collected in Australia and the UK and Pakistan and India. It doesn't matter where you live. It's a very similar dynamic. There are nuances to culture, but it's a very similar dynamic. There are also safety nets, and this is where good management can make a difference. And the critical incidents or stress debriefings are used primarily by fire departments and law enforcement. If there has been what they call a hot, or EMS squads, if there has been a hot incident, an incident that didn't go well, somebody died that shouldn't have died, or something that could have been prevented, or just people got hurt terribly, it is effective for people to all of the team who engage in this and experience it, for them to sit to talk about their experience, and then to use to use what they observed in the incident to figure out how to avoid it from happening again. What to do differently next time. Close that debriefing with, how can we fix this? Knowing that something like this is likely to happen again, what should we do differently? What systems can we put in place? What trainings can we put in place that can modify the outcome? So it can have a useful effect that way. Timeouts, just time out from particular job duties. If someone's been, EMS squad has really had some hot calls, bad calls lately, then go off the street and work in the office for a couple of days. Take a time out from the intensity of the work. Self-care plans are an effective method, and I learned this from the director of an agency, the nonprofit that provides victim assistance services and answers hotline calls from victims. She says that she requires every one of her employees each year, when they have the performance appraisal and they set their work goals, they must also set a self-care plan. And the goals must be totally unrelated to work. It might be that they're going to hike a 14, or it might be that they're going to, lose weight, go on a diet. It might be that they're going to date more. It might be that they're going to do whatever they're going to do, but it cannot be related to work. And she said, and then when they are evaluated on each year on their performance appraisal, they are also asked to report, did you achieve the goals on your self-care plan? And the purpose of this is to force every employee to realize work is work, but you must take care of yourself. You must do that. You must find time to do this. I've started using self-care plans for my graduate students. Because graduate school, it's tough. You're trying to balance everything, your own personal life, your work life, your academic life, and things just get upside down so easily. So I've started requiring self-care plans for students, and I'm telling you, it really works. I get very positive feedback at the end of the semester. Job redesign is a strategy. If particular jobs are the burnout jobs, then there's something wrong with the way that job is structured. There's too much emotional intensity for it. Early intervention is also effective. In the survey, the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board used a part of my survey to survey federal employees last year because they wanted to learn about what they call the emotive burden of the jobs. And they just issued a report last summer from looking at the data. What they found is a curvilinear relationship in terms of supportive management. What they learned is that those people who feel like they have really supportive supervisors, if those supervisors are supportive always and early on, they're much less likely to feel like they're going to burn out. They're much less likely to want to leave the job. What they also found, though, is if a job is emotionally intense, if the person is feeling burned out, and if they're feeling close to crispy, it doesn't matter how supportive that supervisor is. That supervisor can't fix the problem, and that person is out the door. So early and consistent intervention and support really makes a difference in terms of forestalling turnover and forestalling the worst effects of it. So it's important to acknowledge the emotive load. It's important to be self-aware. It's important for employers to be honest about the job. There is value in appraising the emotive skills of job applicants. The same supervisor who uses self-care plans with great success I was asking her how can you screen for someone who has good emotive skills? And she said, the best thing I've found is during the interview, I simply asked the candidate, she says, I will say, tell me about a time when you lost your cool on your last job, or when you really felt upset in your last job. And she says, I don't care what they say. There's no right or wrong answer. But she says, if that person sits there and says, I just never lose my cool. I'm okay. She says, if I hear that interview is done, that person's out the door, because that person is not self-aware, and it's not going to work. It's interesting. Training and coaching, especially in terms of helping people learn to regulate their own emotive state, matters. Performance appraisals very, very rarely reward emotional labor. I published a study some years back after looking at a boatload of performance appraisal forms. And I don't know how many I looked at, maybe 50, and maybe one really got to the point of the emotive burden of that job. Usually all we'll see at best is a question that says, gets along well with others. But that's not deep enough, that's not enough. The fact of the matter is that emotional labor is work, and it is tiring, and we don't give credit for it. And we should, because it's done in order to get the job done. Well, let me move your attention a bit now to gender and the difference that gender makes. And when I first started studying emotional labor, I did it because I thought it would be the key that would unlock the question about why women always earn less than men. And I naively assumed it was just because women do emotional labor, men don't. And I learned very quickly that is not the case. But the kind of emotional labor that men and women do is different, and it's culturally normed. And when we look at it in terms of men's jobs and women's jobs, it's not the cognitive skills that differ, it's the emotive skills. What do we expect from an elementary school teacher versus a law enforcement officer? Bachelor's degree? What are the cognitive skills? You can list them out. There's not a whole lot of difference. But we expect very different emotive skills. Or at least emotive performances. We know that behavior is culturally normed. We know that in role, emotive expressiveness sort of travels on different sides of the highway. We expect men to behave one way, and we expect or script women to behave another way, to show a different effect. If a man is assertive, that's great. If a woman is assertive, she typically is criticized as being too bossy, too pushy. We have scripts, and we pretty much hold people to this. We also know that jobs are segregated by gender, largely due to the emotive demands of the job. So the workplace, if you take the workplace and if you boil cultural norms down, you reduce it, create a reduction to those norms, thicken it up, it all shows up in our organizations. The organization becomes a microcosm of cultural norms. 90% across the nation, this is national data, 90% of elementary school teachers are women. Less than 12% of law enforcement officers are women. Now, that's not randomness. Women comprise almost 2/3 of the local government workforce everywhere. But they're segregated. They're concentrated in the public schools, especially in the elementary schools, in public health offices, and in social services. I published a paper, I just call it mom work versus dad work, but it captured what I'm talking about how appropriate emotive expressiveness tracks down different sides of the highway for women and men, and it affects the kinds of jobs women and men are thought appropriate for. It affects the kinds of jobs that women and men think they are appropriate for. But it really scripts us in a way that causes us to jump to conclusions and to lose some of the skills and not take advantage of all of the skills that the whole workforce has to offer. It is important to understand that this relational part of the job is as much a part of performance as the cognitive aspect. And this is the drum that I've been beating, and it's the drum I'm beating tonight, and I'll continue to beat, because it is a part of the job. And it is simply naive to assume and to try to just write it off, to disappear out of our job descriptions. What do you talk about after work? You don't talk about how many forms you filled. You talk about how you feel about what you did. That's what you talk about. You talk about the emotive part. When your job keeps you up at night, it's typically the emotive part. You know, it's what happened, how you felt about what happened, how angry you got, or how happy you were that keeps you awake at night. It's the emotive part. So this is just a slide because I like it. It captures cultural norms and gender expectations. You know, when there is a woman police officer, she will normally say she gets called in for the compassion piece. She gets called in to do the nice thing. You know, if there's a domestic violence abuse, it's like, let's get her in to make sure she can calm this down some. You know, there are affective expectations for people. I think of this as gender and affect being recursive. Men perform emotional labor, women perform emotional labor, but it's recursive in terms of dependent upon and formed by the norms that are thought, you know, to be appropriate for men versus women. So my takeaways for you this evening are, I want you to understand that public service jobs require emotional labor. And a lot of them have some real emotional intensity to them. I want you to understand that emotional labor is as important, if not more important, than the cognitive labor. And that some people are better at it than others, and those who are better at it ought to be rewarded for that because they're working double time. That person that has to go back in and calm down Bob, because Bob always gets upset, that person being sent in to calm Bob down is doing double time. So let's give them some credit for that. That's something that others can't do. That is a skill. I want you to know that emotional labor produces the meaningfulness. It is what gives people a sense that they're doing something that's worthwhile. I have asked people who've worked on the emergency medical squads, people who see and hear and smell terrible things, say, why do you keep doing that? And I was talking to one once, and he said, you know, I asked myself the same question, but he said, every now and then, I really make a difference. I keep that person alive. And it's like, that's why I do it. It is emotionally meaningful. Well, how good is that? You get paid to do something, and you're doing something that really does make a difference. I want you to be aware the next time you're looking at a job description or looking at your own job description, that to think that that job only requires cognitive and physical components is a charade, and you should be asking others who do that work about the whole job, not just the pieces that are there in the words. We also pretend there is no gender bias, when absolutely there's gender bias. It's as if we are simply incapable of not being biased in that regard. But we need to be smart about it. Because when we essentialize emotive responses to just thinking of it as that's masculine, that's feminine, we lose a good portion of the skills of our workers. People who can do so much more than we even give them credit for or try them out for. So that's my gig, and I will be happy to answer any questions you have or give you any thoughts I have or explain anything more. Yes?
So I work for the college here. I used to be an elementary school teacher and a junior high teacher.
Yeah.
My question is, do you ever think the gender norms are going to change? Because I don't want to say I found it offensive, but every time there was an issue with a troubled child, I would be the person called in.
Oh, he can take care of it. Let's get the man down here. But that happens in every elementary school. The male teacher gets called in.
It does, and I'm retired military, so it's even
Yes.
worse.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I get it on both sides.
So you put on the role.
Exactly. So
Yes.
but I don't want to be the hard guy all the time.
Exactly.
So when
But
does
you're
that-
forced into that role.
So when does that change? Or how long is it going to take for that to change?
I don't know. What do you think?
I don't see it happening in my lifetime.
Give me some
I hope in my children's lifetime, but I don't see it in mine. So.
because the case you're making is exactly the case I'm making. That you're forced into this procrastinating bed. You've got to be the tough guy. You can come in and you can be authoritative. And you may not feel like being authoritative.
No, I don't want to.
But it's like, roll them in, you know, put them on the stage, do it. You know, and then the woman gets called, you know, rolled in on the stage to be compassionate and nurturing. I'm not a nurturant person, you know. So, you know, it's like,
So kind of on that same line, it seems like we kind of a Lipsky-esque like shorthand for gender norms. Do you see that with other types of emotional labor that you've done in your research, where you know we have this situation, obviously we need a shorthand to this person because that's their emotional labor that they're best at. Is that prevalent within your research, you think?
I'm not sure I follow your question, so ask it me in a different way.
Fair enough. So Lipsky kind of says that when we're looking at a bureaucratic...
Mike, let's keep with street level.
Yeah, street level bureaucrats,
all right.
exactly. So, you know, the street level bureaucrat has shorthand that helps them like solve their cases faster because they're overloaded. Do you see a similar scenario within emotional labor where there's a shorthand that these people develop over time and it makes it easier for them to develop a proper response, develop the better, you know, next step for them?
For those who stay in the job, yes. You know, so two thoughts come to mind. One is the investigator in Chicago who's described himself as an emotional chameleon, and he's good at this because he's very aware of what he's doing, and he has scripts in the back of his mind. He figures he knows which one to pull out and which card to play. That's what he does. Another thought that comes to mind is the 911 call taker who said, you know, that he said, I was trained to handle all these consoles and do all this dispatch and all this was so, you know, all this very sophisticated equipment. I could probably wait to hit that console, you know, because they put them through a rigorous training process in terms of all telecommunications. Then they have to learn about all emergency response services, and then they have to learn the GIS system and put this all together. And he said, I was so eager, so I got to my console my first morning that I was actually doing the job, and I got my first call, and he said, I was totally unprepared because it was the screaming and the hysteria. And he said, I had to figure out how to calm that person down enough and how to keep myself calm. And he said, I did that work for a while, and he said, this was not for me. So he said, I quit that job. I went out and I sold insurance. And he said, I did that work for about a year and a half, and he said, I thought I was going to die. I hated my job. I was not making a difference in anybody's life. So he said, I figured out I'm going to go back to the emergency call taking, but I'm going to learn how to do it. And he developed systems that work for him. You know, in terms of how he thinks about it, he learned how to take breakaways, you know, after a hot call when it's really intense. He said, you know, I've learned what works best for me. I back away from the console, someone takes over, I go outside, I have a smoke, I do the, you know, in other words, you develop systems. I was speaking to international aid workers in Haiti after the earthquake, and this is a fascinating group of people who simply fly from disaster to disaster, a huge global, nonprofit that provides disaster services. So, and they fly from one disaster to another, and they see terrible things. And they were I was talking to them about emotional labor. One of them stopped me in mid-sentence and said, thank you so much for talking to us, because everybody else comes and talks to us about housing, and they talk to us about medical care, and they talk to us about things, and nobody talks to us about our work. And then he started talking about how hard it is, and he talked about the incredibly high turnover rate, and then he talked about those who stay in the job a long time. And there aren't very many of them, but he says they're really very idiosyncratic. They've figured out how to do this and how to make sense of it in their mind and in their heart. It was fascinating. And then when I started thinking about these kinds of incredible, emotionally intense jobs, because the people are hysterical and they're homeless, they've lost everything. And here you are dealing with this, and you can see the hope, like in Haiti, you can see the hopelessness of it, even if they did have a home. And it's like, what does it take to do that work? And it takes a lot of head work and heart work at the same time. It's very unique. It's an individual thing. You can't read about it in a book and just figure out how to do it. I was interviewing a firefighter, and he talked about just a bad incident where people were burned to death that shouldn't have been burned to death. It was just awful. And I said, how do you, and when he was telling the story, the more he told it, the more I realized this was a long time ago. But he was talking about it as if it was just last week. It was so real to him. And as I probed, he said, this is what I do. I love this work because normally things don't go bad, they go good. But he said, I have cabinets in my head. And when something really bad happens, I put the smells, I put the tastes, I put the visions, I put the sounds in this cabinet, and I close that door. And he says, I only open it when I can look at it, when I can deal with it. And then when I can't, I put it back, I shut that door again. That's his way of dealing with it. Other people suffer terribly if they try to compartmentalize like that. It's very individual. And there's been no training in this. There's been no coaching in this. You know, law enforcement officers have a hard time because and EMS squads too, oftentimes they're afraid to show their own emotion because they think that they'll be seen as weak. And if they're seen as weak, then their colleague who needs to rely on them and feel safe with them won't feel safe with them next time. So they have a tremendously difficult time with that. Women's jobs tend to do a better job on this. I interviewed people working at a domestic violence center, and I said, you know, how do you deal with the case when a woman is here and you think she's on her feet, and then she goes out and she gets killed by the axe? And they said, well, every single week we require people to talk about their cases. We require people to talk about how they feel about their cases. You know, that's in a weekly staff meeting. You know, but that's a more effective way than just putting it off and dealing with it at PRN. So, idiosyncratic, yes.
I'm really interested in this idea of self-care plans.
Yes.
And you mentioned the ways in which HR overlooks emotional labor, and I'm also interested in the ways in which they actually obstruct it, or if just by not addressing it is a form of obstruction. So, for example, like I love this idea of self-care plan, but if I were to, I immediately worry, could I actually have my students do that? Or my graduate assistant do that? Or different faculty do that? Or would that, so, and especially if I have no power or authority, how can you embed those kind of ethos or those kinds of values or those kinds of strategies at a lower level if you're unable to change the culture from above?
You make changes wherever you can. And if you can only affect 3 people, then you affect 3 people. Give them the tools. But in your language, we are so reluctant to think about the emotive side. We are so reluctant to go, well, how can I force them to do this? We are so accustomed to just hiding it. I will tell you this. I was asked to speak to a group of mid-career Pakistani men. And I was in Pakistan to give them a lecture on emotional labor. Oh my God, this is going to work. And I was the only woman in the room, and I'm telling you, that audience got it faster than any audience I had ever spoken to. And I've spoken to a number of other Asian audiences since then. I spoke to the National HR Service in Taiwan. Culturally, Asians get it a little more than certainly Europeanists get it. It's interesting to see the nuances of this. I'm sure I answered your question, but.
So it sounds like resilience is a huge part of being able to deal with emotional labor.
Yeah.
Does your research suggest that that's based on personality traits or some kind of instinct, or can it be
I'm
taught
doing
or
an
trained?
international survey right now, trying to look at the big 5 personality traits and see if they correlate with capacity, interest, and ability to perform emotional labor. And I haven't had time to look at that data yet. My hunch is it probably won't relate as neatly as I would like it to. We know that there are individual differences. We know that different jobs vary in their level of emotional demands. And we know that people vary in their ability to perform emotional labor. But in terms of the specifics of it, ask me 6 months from now. I will have been in the data more deeply by then.
So we have this kind of, we were just discussing it before your lecture, is this idea of emotional intelligence, and,
Yes.
and we're starting to introduce it at the college level and in our coursework, and yet it would seem, and I don't know if your research would suggest this, but that may be too late. You know, are we looking at, you know, talking to our children that we push this IQ thing on as young people, and then we suddenly expect them to be workers that understand their emotions? And is there any work being done or any research being done to look at introducing that to our youth? Is how do we introduce emotional intelligence in our elementary students?
Well, I thought Daniel Goleman's work of 20 years ago was really making inroads in the education establishment on that. I'm not in, you know, I haven't gotten into the education literature, but I thought that was the whole incentive and why it was adopted and became so popular within K-12. Am I wrong on that?
I know that our child in
Gets
eighth grade
nothing
gets
on it?
you know, they really get
It's a
nothing.
terrible mistake. You know, we're missing.
She
We're
can stay at
failing.
home.
You know, we're failing to help people develop all the skills they have, all the life skills they have. Yeah.
So while I was listening to you, I just spent the whole weekend in a generations class, and I was kind of wondering what your research has found. You know, how this is being taken in. You know, if it's gaining more traction in the millennial era, or the baby boomer era, or the transcendent era, and kind of what the hope is for the future.
It's gaining more traction among younger workers, but in terms of emotive skills on the job, they're better among older workers, a little bit, not a whole lot, but and part of it has to do with if you can stick it out. You stick it out because you've learned how to deal with it. You're better at it. So it's kind of a loose connection, but that's sort of how it's going. In terms of the original question, one of my favorite interviews, when I first started doing research in this, I was using the word emotional labor and interviewing people, and I realized that didn't work when I was interviewing a prison warden in Illinois. And I and my co-authors, trotted in as academics and said, thank you so much for making time for us today, and we're going to talk to you about emotional labor and emotions in the workplace. And he sits behind his chair and he says, well, little lady, let me tell you this. Emotions don't belong in the workplace. And then we started explaining what we meant. That was about sensing what is going on around you, what the emotional state of the other person is, and how you modify your own behavior in order to either bring that person down or raise that person up. And he listened for a while, leaned back, and he said, oh, I do that every day of the week. That's mostly my whole job. And all of a sudden we have it. And then he just started talking. But we don't like to use the word emotion. Or if we think emotion means angry. And we are so afraid of anger. We're so uncomfortable with the term that we have a very difficult time with it. I'm hoping the more we talk about it, the more emotional labor becomes just a piece of our canon, that in fact we do learn about it more and we do investigate it more, and we take away the stigma and the fear of it. Yes?
As emotional labor is trying to be brought into job descriptions, have you seen or read any research or done any of your own of whether or not there's a bottom-up or a top-down effect on incorporating it into the workplace?
I have talked with some folks at Merit Systems Protection Board here, some folks in the Central Personnel Agency in Taiwan, and they are clearly, they get it, and they're interested in it. But in terms of whether it really filters down into the managers, or the people who do the job analyses, I don't know. This is really, I love doing research that's new and really cuts new ground. But this is really new ground. So there's not a track record that says, yes, it was tried here, 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 and here. Ask me a decade from now, maybe I can say that. Yes?
How have you've worked at multiple universities? How have you seen emotional labor play out in the university setting or in the classroom? And I'm thinking that not just from the administrative standpoint, but this move toward online education and what that might mean for
That
them.
automatically rules out any emotional labor?
I don't know that it does.
What's busy online?
What do
That's it.
you think about even how we conduct ourselves with promotion team and all that? I see so many aspects.
Academics are their own thing, and they're probably one of the hardest industries to crack. It's interesting to me when I have, in all the papers I've presented, that a handful of people get it and get it automatically. Others sort of think about it and come back with questions, and others just see it as frivolous, just because it's not in the canon. It's closer to the canon now. But I've been doing this for well over a decade. In terms of how we do our business, we are literally children of the Enlightenment. That period of time, that philosophical state that says that we think and therefore we are. Well, we think and we feel. This is what Antonio Damasio has written, talking about Descartes' error. It's a fabulous book. And he says, look, when the Enlightenment era was really catapulted forward with Descartes' notion that it's body versus mind. And so we've been training the mind. So our academic exercises are all the mind. And we pay no attention. And you can go to the gym for your body. But there's no place to go for the emotive part. It's not taught. It's not in the textbooks. That's my argument, is to put it in the textbooks. But it's among my colleagues, some of them just don't get it, and others do. It's a long, slow slog. The same people who would get so upset about something and will really, they still won't be able to process that the role of emotion in their job and how it affects their work, and how that rejected manuscript, affects them, and how they feel about it, and how they feel about themselves, and how they deal with that. Yes?
I practiced law for about 10 years.
And you're still living? Okay.
A lot of that was human resource employment law, and I'm wondering if you have encountered any resistance from human resource professionals to making inquiries or job conditions relating to mental health type issues, and just generally what your thoughts on that might be with the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that might fit into this.
See, when we think about emotion, when we do talk about it, we automatically think there's something wrong. We don't think about emotion as happiness and joy and job satisfaction and fulfillment and pleasure. We think of it as nutty, crazy, dangerous. We can't even think of emotion as everything that it is. We categorize it as being extreme, and then we think, okay, well, how can we fix this? So it's important to talk about it in a way that is normal, like cognition is normal. And are there extremes that play, all extremes play out emotionally, but that's not the problem. The capacity to regulate one's own emotion is a clear, an indicator or something that will keep you from seeming third standard deviation and therefore mentally ill. All mental illness is, culturally, is just that your behavior is outside the norm. Mm-hmm. So we have this sense of what norms are, and we think these people are normal, those people are crazy. Yes.
I have a question about KSAs, knowledge, skills,
Yeah,
and abilities.
yes.
And at least in my head, it feels like we've stuck so closely to those to try to encourage diversity, right? Because
And objectivity.
right, that
Yes.
it's just about this, you know, it's not because you went to the same college as that person or they're
Yeah.
the same color or whatever, some affinity you have is
Yeah.
irrational, it's about the KSAs, right? So I feel my own little HR hands, you know, locking onto those KSAs and I'm wondering, are we really giving away objectivity if we try to add the emotional component?
And daughter of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
It's, you know, that's what we're so afraid of.
Yeah.
Let's be objective.
Yeah.
But in fact, think about the people who are really good at dealing with the difficult student. You know, the upset parent. That's an important skill. Think about the instructors who get the best course evaluations. It's the affective, it's not just information passed. Sometimes it's not that much information passed, but students feel good. They feel a rapport with this person. They feel like the person understands them. It's all the emotive part of it. So let's just be honest about it and appreciate the fact that, you know, that is a skill, and it's an important skill.
Yeah. So there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes work then that needs to go into how do I operationalize that so that I can ask you something or look at something in your record or see it when I interview you and say, you have more
Well,
of that.
that's a challenge
Yeah.
because emotive capacity really doesn't fit neatly into your IQ test
Right.
and your test scores
Yeah.
and your GREs. And we're so accustomed to that we diminish or dismiss all the intelligences beyond that. That's a mistake. We cut ourselves short on that. We do it for the right reasons, try to be objective, but in fact we're losing too much, I think, by simply relying on that. We know enough now that we should be smarter about embracing the whole person who comes into a job. I mean, we knew this, you know, back from the, you know, early management studies, but workers don't leave, you know, their whole emotive state and everything that's bothering them at the office door or the factory door. They bring everything in. Okay? You should know that by now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so I'm going to start a new recording because this might be a divergent subject, but I was sort of curious. So I was curious about emotional labor and how it might apply to things that aren't considered occupational, but really kind of are, because you mentioned Hochschild, and I think you're probably also familiar with her writing on the second shift and double,
Yeah.
women working full time and then being mothers and coming home,
And
being
then
the housekeepers.
full-time at home.
And so I was curious about the emotional labor of that, and or just the emotional impression of that, like, and the effects of that.
There is emotional labor in a lot of life. I am focusing my attention on the emotional labor between 8 and 5 on the job.
Mhm.
That which someone is, you know, and for the person to do their job right, they have to exercise emotional labor as much as they have to exercise cognitive labor. Is there emotional labor after hours? You bet there is. And there's some interesting writing, you know, on that, but I'm trying to stay focused
Oh, sure.
on that.
Yeah. Figured it might be divergent.
Yeah. So yes, it's there. You know, there's also just the issue of dealing with coworkers. And I've tried, you know, and so it doesn't matter what sector you're working in. And I've tried to stay away from that just because I care so much about public service. And public service jobs they can be so extreme with what you experience that I just want to shine a light on that. We'll leave it to some others to shine lights elsewhere.
Mm.
How about, is there one more?
Right behind it.
So when you're talking about gender norms, I'm hearing this whole idea that women have this kind of gender norm and men have this kind of gender norm. But are you finding that is not always the case? I mean, I feel like, me personally, I fall outside of kind of the women gender norm. And And are you seeing a movement away from women being a stereotype and men being a stereotype?
A little bit, and I love it. I just love it. Because all of a sudden, you know, people's whole capacity is being appreciated instead of you being, you know, shaped into a box. I just love it. And I think the millennials are better at that than certainly any other generation we've had. You know, it's more of an embrace of the whole person without labels attached. So I'm hopeful.
Well, in the interest of time, we're going to close the formal part of the evening. I think if you have something you want to ask Dr. Guy or say hi to her afterwards, we have a few minutes. But I want to thank you for your time. Let's show our appreciation.